Today, we're tackling a really fascinating and kind of paradoxical chapter of the Cold War. It's a period known as Detente, and it was basically a time when the world's two biggest enemies decided to take a step back from the brink.
And that's the million-dollar question, right? For decades, the US and the Soviet Union had their fingers hovering over the big red button. So, what gives? Why in the late 1960s did they suddenly start talking to each other? Let's dig in.
To really get why they started talking, you have to remember just how tense things were. I mean, the post-war world was living under this constant, dark cloud of suspicion, hostility, and the very real threat that everything could just end.
And this was the moment that changed everything. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't some theoretical exercise. It was real. The world was literally holding its breath, closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. And that shared terror, that experience of staring right into the abyss, it left a huge mark on leaders in both Washington and Moscow. They just knew they had to find another way to handle this rivalry before it blew up in everyone's faces.
So out of that crisis comes this shift in thinking, what people call the Great Thaw. You've got new, more pragmatic leaders coming in. In the US, you have President Richard Nixon and his top advisor Henry Kissinger. And over in the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev's in charge. The thing is, both sides, for their own very different reasons, were ready for a change.
And this is super important, so let's break it down. For the US, the Vietnam War was a total nightmare. It was draining money, and the public was just sick of it. On top of that, you had all this turmoil at home, riots, protests. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was practically going broke, trying to keep up with the insane costs of the arms race. So, for both of them, it came down to this. We need to fix things at home. We need to spend money on our own people, not on more and more bombs.
And that's where this word comes in, détente. It's French, and it basically means an easing of tensions. That's the perfect way to think about it. This wasn't about the US and USSR suddenly becoming best friends. No way. It was more like two rivals in a standoff agreeing to, lower their weapons a bit and actually talk. It was about managing the danger.
So this whole new vibe wasn't just empty words. It led to some actual real-deal diplomatic action, some of the biggest agreements of the whole Cold War, in fact. They started building a new playbook for how to avoid blowing up the planet.
And you can see how it all unfolded right here. It all starts in '69 with these talks called SALT. That's for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. A few years later, boom, 1972, we get the first big treaty signed. Then things really heat up, in a good way, in '75 with the Helsinki Accords. And it all leads up to what was supposed to be the grand finale in '79, the SALT II Treaty.
So let's talk about that first one, SALT I. This was huge. It was the first real proof that, hey, maybe this whole détente thing could actually work. I mean, after years of just building more and more weapons, they finally sat down to try and put a cap on the whole crazy thing.
Okay, so what did SALT I actually do? Well, this is where it gets kind of weirdly brilliant. It limited something called anti-ballistic missiles, or ABMs. Those are the defensive missiles meant to shoot down incoming nukes. By limiting their defenses, both sides were basically agreeing to be totally vulnerable to each other. The logic, as grim as it is, was if I can't stop you and you can't stop me, then neither of us is crazy enough to start a fight. It's that whole idea of mutually assured destruction. They also put a freeze on the number of long-range missiles, which was a really big deal. So if SALT I was the nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts agreement, the Helsinki Accords in 1975, well, that was the peak of the mountain. That was the big symbolic moment. And this wasn't just the two superpowers. We're talking 35 countries from both East and West, all meeting in one place. So the deal was split into three parts, or baskets. Two were pretty straightforward. Everyone agreed to respect the existing borders in Europe, which the Soviets really wanted, and they agreed to try and trade more. But basket number three, that was a diplomatic bombshell. It was the human rights basket. In it, the Soviet Union actually signed a piece of paper promising to respect individual freedoms. Now for them, it probably seemed like just some words to get what they wanted, but for people living under Soviet rule, it was everything. It was a promise they could point to, a tool they could use to fight for their own freedom. It planted seeds that took a while to grow, but boy, did they grow. So for the better part of a decade, it seemed like it was working. The world was a less scary place. But all of that, it was built on a very fragile foundation, and it was all about to come crashing down because of one single event. And it really looked like things were still on track. In 1979, President Carter and Brezhnev got together to sign SALT II.
This was supposed to be the follow-up act, even better than the first one. It promised deeper cuts to their nuclear arsenals, stricter limits. It looked like the next great step.
Yeah, it never happened. The treaty was signed, but it never actually got approved by the US Senate. The whole mood had changed. That spirit of cooperation, it was just gone.
And here's the reason why. December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. For the United States and its allies, this was it. This was proof that the Soviets couldn't be trusted. In that one moment, any chance of passing the SALT II treaty just vanished. And just like that, Detente was dead.
So, was it all for nothing? Just a little break in the middle of a 50-year fight? Well, not exactly. The story of what Detente left behind is complicated. There were some big wins and some pretty big losses.
This chart really lays it out perfectly. Take SALT I. In the short term, awesome. It slowed the arms race. But long term, it had this huge loophole. It didn't stop them from developing new tech, like MIRVs, which let you stick multiple warheads on one missile. So the arms race just shifted. Same story with Helsinki. It calmed things down over borders, which was great. But that little human rights promise, it ended up helping to tear apart the Soviet bloc from the inside out in the 80s. And SALT II failing, that just kicked off a whole new, scary arms buildup, what some people call the Second Cold War.
So here's the bottom line. No, Detente didn't end the Cold War, but it absolutely changed the game. It proved that the two sides could talk, that they could make deals. It pulled the world back from the immediate edge of nuclear war, and it planted those seeds of change that would really blossom about a decade later. It was a brief but really, really important thaw in a long frozen conflict.
And that leaves us with this huge question, one that's just as real today as it was back then. When you look at the story of Detente, you see just how fragile trust can be between adversaries. It makes you wonder, right? In a world of competing powers, is cooperation always just a temporary strategy, or can it ever become a lasting reality?